Welcome to Roil Road, where we ask the question, what road are we all on and how do we navigate it? Today, Brian Martinez and I will be doing a deep dive into recent politics of voting laws. Democrats have accused Republicans of trying to ignore the voters and subvert elections. How true is that really? Republicans have accused Democrats of trying to steal future elections through a nationalized voting law that they've tried to pass. How true is that one? We're rolling up our sleeves to get to the bottom of these claims. But first, let me tell you about Roil. Roil is a better way to enjoy content online. You just tell Roil which internet content you like, such as YouTube channels, podcasts, and more, and then you can access them all in one place, the Roil app. It also uses content interconnection to break free from tech monopolies. Click the links below to learn more. Roil is just getting started, but it's going to be big. Be among the first to discover Roil. Now, let's get this show on the road. Hello, Brian Martinez. So good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you too, John. How are things?
I've been well. I've been looking into the voter reform laws, and I've got a lot to share to you about that today. And how have you been?
I've been good. I just got done with a pretty, I would say, rough week of substitute teaching. Kids back from their winter break, and they're very restless, I'll just put it that way.
All right. Well, I've spent hours over the last few days trying to parse out the election reform issues that have been in the news. And I have a little bit of a deep dive stacked up here. And the first thing I want to share, it is now Thursday, January 20th. And yesterday, Joe Biden gave a press conference where one of the topics covered was this election reform bill that has sort of gone down to defeat so far. And the questions he was asked related to, can we consider the election that's going to be held in November 2022 to be a fair election? And I found his answer, to be honest, really quite shocking. He was asked it sort of two times in two different ways. And here's the first interaction.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking of voting rights legislation, if this isn't passed, do you still believe the upcoming election will be fairly conducted and its results will be legitimate?
Well, it all depends on whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of the election. And it's one thing, look, maybe I'm just being too much of an optimist. Remember how we thought not that many people were going to show up to vote in the middle of a pandemic? We had the highest voter turnout in the history of the United States of America. Well, I think if, in fact, no matter how hard they make it for minorities to vote, I think you're going to see them willing to stand in line and defy the attempt to keep them from being able to vote. I think you're going to see the people who try to keep from being able to show up, showing up and making the sacrifice that needs to be made in order to change the law back to what it should be. But it's going to be difficult. I make no bones about that. It's going to be difficult. But we're not there yet. We've not run out of options yet, and we'll see how this moves.
So here we have the first answer. Basically, is this going to be a fair and legitimate election? And it's a likely not, right? That in the absence of the reforms passing that he wanted that now we see have not passed, he's throwing public confidence into doubt. It's a shocking thing, really, for me to see a president do. He was asked again later in the press conference, and he doubled down. Let me share that with you as well.
Right.
I wanted to clarify, a moment ago, you were asked whether or not you believed that we would have free and fair elections in 2022 if some of these state legislatures reformed their voting protocols. You said that it depends. Do you think that they would in any way be illegitimate?
Oh, yeah, I think it easily can be illegitimate. Imagine if, in fact, Trump has succeeded in convincing Pence to not count the votes. Imagine if
In regards to 2022, sir, the midterm election.
2022, I mean, imagine if those attempts to say that the count was not legit. You have to recount it, and we're not going to count, we're going to discard the following votes. I mean, sure, I'm not saying it's going to be legit. It's the increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed.
So, the reforms are not going to be passed. That became very clear this week. And so he's now telling us that the election is not likely to be legitimate. I can't believe it's coming to this, but Joe Biden is now making Donald Trump look less crazy. Could we please have presidents stop undermining public trust in United States elections? I'm going to be doing a deep dive into this, but what bothers me about this press conference is Biden's job is to uphold an institution, and human institutions are never perfect. But let's estimate that our elections are, say, 95% well organized and executed, and 5% needing improvements to their policies and procedures. And I don't mean 5% of the vote is shifted one way or the other, but maybe a polling spot should be on this corner instead of that corner. Maybe it should open earlier. There's always room for improvement. I give the 95-5 estimate because I think that reflects the true state of affairs. People have been trying for a long time in the United States to have well-executed elections, and we've been a beacon to the world in that regard. We have lots of practice and an unbroken chain going back to 1788. I know it's in vogue right now to pretend that the current generation is the first group of people who ever thought of trying to do things well or fairly, but they're not that special. Anyway, back to Biden. He has an office to uphold. And part of that office is, yes, of course, give attention to the 5% that needs improvement. But you must also give the country its due and present that 5% in proportion. The president should not see it as his job to tell citizens that the country is worse than it is. So what I have lined up here is a deep dive into the policies and rhetoric involved in the Democrats' recent push to federalize voting laws. And federalized voting laws meaning that historically voting rules have been set at the state level, and the Democrats' push is to take a lot of these issues away from the states with an overriding federal law. I'm going to do my best with this complex topic. I'm not an expert, but I've spent hours looking into it. So consider this a diligent, non-expert's assessment. Okay, so first, let's talk about what the Democrats have been wanting. So what is it that Biden is seeking to pass and is now bemoaning that democracy can't exist without it passing? That's an exaggeration, but not as much of an exaggeration as I wish that it did. So that it was. So here is a breakdown from 538.com about what has been in the various Democrat voting proposals. And I think it's important to go through this in some detail, because if you listen to voices on the right, they might be inclined to say things like, well, Democrats are just planning to pass this thing and steal all the elections. And we need to see, does that bear out? If you look at the specifics of what the Democrats are asking for, does that bear out? And there's a concept that I think about, I call it vampire rules. Okay, vampire rules have set in this partisan environment. And this is a reference to the idea that in vampire lore, a vampire cannot enter your house unless you invite them in. And so if you see a seemingly nice person, but you think they might be a vampire, don't let them in, because once they're in the house, they've got you. And in political polarization, we end up thinking, well, the other side's vampires. We're not going to let even any molecule of them coming in, anything, we got to reject it all, because lurking underneath is bad stuff. It's obviously a terrible way to govern, way to relate to people. It makes compromise impossible, but it is really common. So let's set aside the vampire rules and look at, okay, what are the Democrats actually asking for? So 3 different acts. So two of them were recently combined, but the best way to understand this is there's three distinct acts and then a fourth, which is a possibility that the Democrats have rejected so far. So the first is the For the People Act, which ballooned into this almost 800-page sort of laundry list of things that Democrats wanted. And that is not what Biden has been pushing. The For the People Act got pruned down into the Freedom to Vote Act. So, and that's what Biden was actually pushing at this point. And so the Freedom to Vote Act is what I think it merits to discuss. So here we have a list of provisions. And generally speaking, I think these are good ideas. I think that most of this stuff, this is not amounting to them trying to steal the election. So from the top, prohibit states from requiring an excuse to vote absentee. Okay, so now this is probably a controversial one. There's some people that think, no, voting, you should have to stand in line, go to the polls. My opinion, that's not necessary. I live in Florida, and the rule in Florida, ever since I've lived here for over a decade, has been that anybody can request a ballot be mailed to them, and it'll be mailed to you, and you fill it out, and no postage necessary. You mail it back in. It's super convenient. I think that that's the way it should work. I understand that in 2020 there were some emergency procedures put in place where you didn't have to request a ballot, but states would just send out ballots to all of the registered addresses. I think that's a terrible thing to do, because nobody ever, when they moved, wrote to the voter registration and said, I don't live there anymore. And so that is just a recipe for millions upon millions of stray, redundant ballots to be floating around, which is not a situation we want. But if you have a Florida-like rule, you request it, they send it, you send it back. Perfect. I think that if I was in a state that didn't have that, I would vote for it totally. Next, require states to allow voters to apply for absentee ballots online. Okay, so you don't have to mail something in, you do it online. It's reasonable. If I was in a state, I would vote for that. Prohibit states from requiring absentee ballots to be notarized or have witness signatures. Reasonable. Require states to allow people to register to vote on election day. That one, I don't know. That one I could see might have administrative challenges on a state-by-state basis, but it's not crazy. It's not like them doing that is them trying to steal elections. And that's true of so much of this stuff, right? That this is really, like I said, well, should the polling place be on this corner or that corner? So many of these decisions are just like administrative, just how specifically do you do the procedures? And to try and make that kind of thing into, oh, they're trying to steal the election is just divisive.
Yeah.
Make election day a national holiday. Anyway, so these are the ideas that generally speaking, it's fairly reasonable. One that I would take issue with, that I would definitely oppose, is count all absentee ballots postmarked by election day and received within 10 days. I don't think that you should be counting ballots received 10 days after election day. I think that there is a legitimate interest in early finality to the extent that it's feasible, and that I know it's not going to be possible always to have a winner agreed upon on election day, but I think that that's what we should be shooting for. And voting with the mail absentee, that's a convenience, and it's a reasonable requirement of that convenience that you mail it a few days in advance. I don't see any issue with that. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but generally speaking, that is what's on the table with the Freedom to Vote Act. Okay, now the next was the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And what this relates to is that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had some provisions that said, look, certain states have a history of excluding minorities from voting, which was certainly true. And the federal government should have oversight over those states, and those states should need some additional clearances and approvals for their voting procedures. Well, in 2013, and another case in 2021, the Supreme Court said, well, what was true in 1965, that these states had bad track records, is no longer true 50 years later, and therefore it is no longer reasonable to hold these states to these other standards. Now, that, of course, is like like fingernails on the chalkboard to people in the Northeast. And this is just knowing people in the Northeast, one of their favorite things in life is to just imagine that the South is the most backwards and ignorant place in the world. Okay. They love to imagine that they're just way superior to everybody in the South. And so they saw this and they were like, wait a minute, people in the South the states in the South aren't wearing dunce caps anymore. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but there's definitely part of this dynamic going on. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is attempting to sort of re-up we think that they still need this kind of federal preclearance for these southern states. And am I for or against it? I don't really have an attitude on that. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be the end of the world to go back to how things were a few years ago where there was preclearance. On the other hand, I don't think that there has been a demonstration that there's anything approaching the voter suppression that was happening in 1965 that motivated the original act. But wouldn't be the end of the world. It might be a good idea. I don't know. And then finally, the act that is not on the table, that Biden is not promoting, is a reform to the Electoral Count Act. Okay. And I'll just go ahead and read. The Democrats are not pursuing this, despite the fact, now I'm reading from, there's wide agreement that the Electoral Count Act, which governs Congress's role in certifying state electoral votes, is dangerously sloppy. Ambiguities in its language led to the belief that former Vice President Mike Pence could reject the results of the 2020 election on January 6, 2021, which fueled the deadly attack on the Capitol that day. And crucially, at least 10 Republican senators, Susan Collins, Steve Daines, John Cornyn, blah, 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 are reportedly open to fixing the law, raising the possibility that Electoral Count Act reform could actually attract enough support to overcome the filibuster. Some of the changes being floated include clarifying that the vice president does not have the power to reject electors and increasing the number of lawmakers who must object to a state's electors to trigger a Congress-wide vote. However, these conversations just started last week. This was, I think, in December that this was written, and nothing has formally been proposed yet. Some Democrats, most notably Manchin and Sinema, are on board with this effort, but for now at least, both Schumer and the White House have refused to even consider it, likely out of fear that it would distract from or be seen as a replacement for passing the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Act. So, to the extent that the concern is Donald Trump's efforts to subvert the election by saying, hey, Mike Pence doesn't have to count the votes, and he can just declare a different winner. To the extent that that is the concern, the Democrats have shown themselves, at least so far, to be notably uninterested in that concern. Okay, they are not on board with changing the law that would try to remove that legal theory. Okay. So what do we have next? So my summary would be that these proposals are not crazy to the degree that Republicans are saying that this would be the end of democracy if it passed. I don't agree. Then again, like I said before, elections are human institutions. They will inevitably change over time and will never be perfect. And while I have sympathy with some of these policies, I also have sympathy with the idea that local control, meaning state level laws, are appropriate here. That's how things have always been done. And maybe at this particular moment in time, with historic levels of distrust and political tribalism, is not the time for the Democratic Party to try to force through these provisions with the thinnest possible of congressional margins, meaning a tiny majority in the House and an evenly divided Senate. So those are the provisions that Biden was seeking to promote. And they generally relate to mechanical minutia of how hard is it to get a ballot, an absentee ballot, etc. Now I want to talk about the rhetoric by institutions on the left to try and push for these changes. And I'm going to start there with the Atlantic magazine. So Atlantic magazine, this was a much promoted, ballyhooed piece. The cover article for their January-February 2022 issue. It has definitely had a role in setting the tone, setting the rhetoric on the left. And the title is, so the cover, okay, it's the cover article, January 6th was practice by Barton Gellman. And the title is, Trump's next coup has already begun. January 6th was practice. Donald Trump's GOP is much better positioned to subvert the next election. Okay. He writes, technically, the next attempt to overthrow a national election may not qualify as a coup. It will rely on subversion more than violence, although each will have its place. If the plot succeeds, the ballots cast by American voters will not decide the presidency in 2024. Thousands of votes will be thrown away, or millions, to produce the required effect. The winner will be declared the loser. The loser will be certified president-elect.
Wait, when did this article come out?
The prospect...
I feel like I've seen this before a couple of times.
The prospect of this democratic collapse is not remote. People with the motive to make it happen are manufacturing the means. Given the opportunity, they will act. They are already acting. Okay, that's the opener. That's the opener. Democracy's over. The Republicans are going to throw away millions of votes. And here, so it's a huge piece. This is a 48-page long piece. And so that's the opening paragraph, a couple paragraphs. And I pick it up and I'm like, oh, this is going to be good. We've got 48 pages now where he's going to substantiate all of those claims. Now we're going to see he's got to have the goods. It's the cover story. It's been promoted so much. He goes on to say, just on the next page, for more than a year now, with tacit and explicit support from their party's national leaders, state Republican operatives have been building an apparatus of election theft. Elected officials in Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and other states have studied Donald Trump's crusade to overturn the 2020 election. They have noted the points of failure and have taken concrete steps to avoid failure next time. Some of them have rewritten statutes to seize partisan control of decisions about which ballots count and which to discard, which results to certify and which to reject. They are driving out or stripping power from election officials, who refused to go along with the plot last November, aiming to replace them with exponents of the big lie. They are fine-tuning a legal argument that purports to allow state legislatures to override the choice of voters. Okay, so this is the claim. They are pushing for state legislators to be able to override the choice of voters, which that would be a terrible thing. And I've talked about in other episodes, I do not take what happened January 6th, 2021 lightly at all. And as much as I'm going to rip on this piece, as I'm about to do, I actually do share some of the concerns that are sort of underlying it. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But what we've got here is the claim that the Republicans are trying to, as he said at the very beginning, throw out thousands or millions of votes. They're not going to care how people voted. The Republican legislatures are just going to put in the person that they want. Now, we're in the first couple pages of this 48-page piece. This is the centerpiece of the argument. This is how he started it. And he's given us the sizzle. Where's the steak? Surely he's going to have many specific examples that he's going to be able to point to demonstrate this plot. Spoiler alert, not so much. Okay, so now what does he do next? So next he's going to talk about his time spent interviewing with Richard C. Patterson, who used to be a captain in the New York Fire Department. Some dude, okay, not a person in any position of authority. He believes that he believes what I would say Trump's unsubstantiated claims of a stolen election. This Richard C. Patterson individual has fallen for that. And now we're going to spend the next about 20 pages on him in this piece.
How do we even know that Richard C. Patterson is a real person with these views?
Well,
I mean, we could take it at its word and go with that, but it's a little bit odd because there obviously the author of this piece is trying to like push forward a narrative, and he's coming from a place that he might even believe we need, like what he's doing. He might believe that this is necessary because he's so, I don't know, disgusted or afraid or angry with the other side, the people who either supported Trump by voting for him or were at the the rally that turned into a riot on January 6th or whatever it was. And I guess I'm having a hard time just sort of taking everything on its face, because I think it seems to me, and look, however you feel about Republicans, conservatives, Christians, Democrats, liberals, leftists, whatever, all that aside, I think that one of the biggest problems we have in discussing or in our political discourse, but also just like in discourse in general today, is that there is a serious lack of, how do I put it? There's a serious lack of sympathy for the other side. So there's no when this person, because this is what I think is happening, okay? This person is basically saying there is going to be an election in 2022, and if it doesn't turn out the way I think it should turn out, then there must be some, foul play. They can't even conceive of it not being the case. And the reason for this is because I think that people like this, they have it in their head that if you're a good person, then you vote this way. And if you're a bad person, then you vote this other way. And so the only people who are not going to vote in the way that I think they should must be bad people. And I don't even want to understand what their motives must be. I don't want to understand why they thought that this is in their mind, the best solution to their issue. I have no interest in understanding it, because they are clearly not either stupid, evil, or they've been manipulated in some way. They've been undermined. I think he used the word subversion, to suggest that no one in their right mind could possibly have an interest in maybe their values. I don't even say run counter, because I honestly believe that the average Americans believe a lot of the same things, and we actually have more in common than not. And the only places where we tend to differ is maybe in what the best approach is. So for example, I live in southwestern Virginia, and there's a mix of people here politically, unlike Chicago, where everyone was on the left, and if you weren't, then you just didn't say anything about it because there was this sort of chilling effect, right? You didn't want anyone to know what your politics were. But here there's a mix of liberals and conservatives and libertarians, and everyone is okay with talking about what they think. And it turns out that most of us want the same things, right? We want a safe, healthy place for our children, and we want, the roads to work, and we want a lot of the same things. And the only place where we might differ, again, comes down to what role the state should play in maybe creating solutions, if at all. So, everyone here in Virginia, we live close to nature. Everyone here is an environmentalist. But the difference is that right-wing environmentalists feel like it's their job to preserve the environment and do things for the environment, recycle, etc. And they don't want the state to do it. And the left-wing ones think the state should be a part of the solution. And that's really the only place where it differs. And I'm not on the left, but I'm very sympathetic to their views because I understand what it is they really want. And I guess I said all that because when you create this framing, it makes it really difficult for me to think that you're acting in good faith, because you don't seem, and I don't mean you, I mean the writer of this piece, doesn't seem at all interested in trying to understand why people voted for Trump or didn't vote or voted for Biden or whatever, right?
I'm in a similar situation. I live in Tampa, and Tampa is a true purple city.
Yeah.
We got a lot of Democrats, we've got a lot of Republicans, and that is healthy, that you're constantly interacting with people of both parties, and you see, oh, okay, yeah, no, there's none of us are like evil zombie, Satanists.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all trying to make things happen. The big sort where you've got just locales that are all Democrat or all Republican, it's a pernicious problem, right? Where you don't run into people that are Republican, say, if you're on the coast, or you don't run into people that you know are Republican.
Yeah, they keep it to themselves, right?
And you just build up this caricature that's terrible. Now, is this Patterson guy real? I would estimate yes, right? Because Atlantic is a reputable magazine, and there certainly are plenty of people out there that have really bought into.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that even if Patterson wasn't real, people like him exist. So it doesn't really matter, since he was just used as, whether real or not, as just sort of it's supposed to be the example that this author
Guys, honestly, look at the scary dummy.
Right.
Look at the scary dummy. This is half the country. Is honestly what Barton Gellman was doing there. So now, after 20 pages, remember, we start off hot. All Republicans have a plan. They're going to not care about voters. Then 20 pages on some random dude. Okay, and then he gets to the section where, all right, now we're going to have the details. Now it's going to be his evidence. So he writes the strategic objective. Now this is at page 25 now. The strategic objective of nearly every move by the Trump team after the networks called the election for Joe Biden on November 7th was to induce Republican legislatures in states that Biden won to seize control of the results and appoint Trump electors instead. Every other objective in courtrooms, on state election panels, in the Justice Department, and in the office of the vice president was instrumental to that end. Okay, I agree with that. I think it was horrible what Trump was doing in the aftermath of that election. I don't have a problem with that paragraph. Going on. The electors are the currency in the presidential contest, and under the Constitution, state legislatures control the rules for choosing them. Article 2 provides that each state shall appoint electors in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. Since the 19th century, every state has ceded the choice to the voters, automatically certifying elections who support the victors at the polls. But in Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court affirmed that a state can take back the power to appoint electors. No court has ever said that a state could do that after its citizens had already voted, but that was the heart of Trump's plan. Okay, so what he's doing in this paragraph is articulating really the nugget of the Constitution that does make this a plausible type plan, because back at the founding, you didn't have elections at large with the public. You had the state legislature choosing who the electors were. That's what the Constitution says. And so, in theory, if a state wanted to say, yeah, we're not going to do an election, we're just going to choose our presidential electors in the legislature, and the legislature passed a law to that effect, in theory, that would be constitutional, I suppose. That would be in adherence with Article 2. I'm sure that there would be arguments that the 14th Amendment have overridden Article 2 to that extent.
It would be a terrible idea.
But
it would
be a terrible idea. No legislature has done it or will do it, and because they would all be voted out of office, and their party it would be a huge setback for the party if they did that. Okay. But so he's starting to lay this out. Any details, okay, we're going to need to jump to page 41, okay, to try to get, okay, now here we go. Now he's finally going to explain to us where the actual nefarious stuff is going on. So since the 2020 election, that wasn't the right thing to say, not nefarious stuff, but where the actual laws being passed by Republican legislatures to take the vote away from the people and insert their own electors where that's happening.
So since the 2020 election, I could read it. Trump's acolytes have said about.
Okay, wait. Excuse me. I messed it up. That's not what this paragraph is about.
That's not what
okay,
this
wait. I need to
paragraph
reframe
is about.
this. Okay. The next paragraph is about that, but this paragraph is about. And again, now I'm swinging back to where I'm in sympathy with what he's saying. That there has been a disturbing degree of acquiescence in the Republican Party to sort of be still with Trump even after he went and did all that. Okay. And so the concern is that the individual office holders, who maybe would be a Secretary of State, for example, who's in charge of certifying the vote, that person would be a Trumpist who would be okay with a plan to do what it takes to get the Republican over the line. That's a legitimate concern. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and read that little bit, the next little bit is where it gets into more of the meat as I was talking about.
Since the 2020 election, Trump's acolytes have set about methodically identifying patches of resistance and pulling them out by the roots. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, who refused to find extra votes for Trump, formally censured by his state party, primaried and stripped of his power as chief election officer. Aaron Van Langeveld in Michigan, who certified Biden's victory, hounded off the board of state canvassers. Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona, who signed the state certificate of ascertainment for Biden. Trump has endorsed a former Fox 10 News anchor named Kari Lake to succeed him. I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, but predicting that she will fight to restore election integrity, both past and future.
Right. So what this is highlighting is there were individuals who went in the Republican Party who went against Trump's plan to do what it took to win the election, tabulate the votes in a way that he wins. Okay, that went against that, and it does seem, at least in these cases, that the Republican Party has punished them, and that's not the right thing. They did right. The Republican Party should be promoting them, not punishing them, and that is a bad sign for the Republican Party. But now we're swinging back to the question of
evidence.
They're making the claim that all these Republican legislatures are now passing laws to allow them to throw out the voters. Okay, and so now we're getting to, finally, we're on page 41 of 48. They're going to give us an example. Okay, and if you would like to read.
Sure. Arizona's legislature, meanwhile, has passed a law forbidding Kate Hobbs, the Democratic Secretary of State, to take part in election lawsuits, as she did at crucial junctures last year. The legislature is also debating an extraordinary bill asserting its own prerogative by majority vote at any time before the presidential inauguration to, quote, revoke the Secretary of State's issuance or certification of a presidential elector's certificate of election, end quote. There was no such thing under law as to a method to decertify electors when Trump demanded it in 2020, but state Republicans think they have invented one for 2024. In at least 15 more states, Republicans have advanced new laws to shift authority over elections from governors and career officials in the executive branch to the legislature.
Okay, so I'm just going to comment on this Arizona bill. Okay. The bill in Arizona would empower the legislature to, after the vote's done, to decide, yeah, we're going to not go with the Secretary of State's certified vote count. We're instead going to direct the electors in whatever way we decide. Okay. Now, let's apply first vampire rules, right? Let's apply first vampire rules. So how bad is that really? Okay. One could argue, well, they wouldn't do it unless there was really a problem Maybe things could have gone wrong in the election and blah, blah, blah. So that would be the type of defense. Does that defense stand up? Not to me, it doesn't. Okay. That what happens is these people in the legislature, their whole thing, their greatest asset in life is their relationship to their party. That's what makes them special. That's what gives them their position, is that they are in line with their party. And when there's an election and it's close and people dig in and the parties circle the wagons, the legislature is the last place. The state legislature is the last place that you would want to be seated with the power to decide, yeah, we're going to put the electors this way or that way. So I think that vampire rules, it doesn't apply here. This is truly a bad idea. And so shame on the people in Arizona proposing this bill. Now, as we're going to cover in a moment, it's never going to become law. It died right away in the process. Now, moving on, and we will have a further breakdown in the next story of, well, what to make of the sparse examples that we actually have. Now, they go in the next paragraph saying, in at least 15 more states, Republicans have advanced new laws to shift authority over elections from governors and career officials to executive branch, in the executive branch to the legislature. Okay, so that's their claim in this sentence. In at least 15 more states. No details are provided at all. A link is provided to a morass of a report that points to there's 148 bills. Dang, I thought there was only 50 states, but this report points to there's 148 bills where Republicans are trying to destroy democracy. Not their wording, but roughly that's the intent of what they're saying. And it's, if there's 148 bills, now note they're saying bills, not laws. They're not saying anything that have become laws. Okay, 148. Then surely you can give me a few concrete examples of bad ones, right? No, we don't have the concrete examples. This is reminiscent of the strategy that Trump employed, where he was saying, oh, there's election fraud demonstrated here. And each one that you look into, there's no real there. But by the time you've looked into it, he's already pointed to 20 more. Okay. And what's going on there is that the morass, the confusion, the miasma, that's the point. That we're just going to we're going to claim, oh, it's happening all around us. It's absolutely endemic. It's everywhere. But we can't give you an example. It's something that is difficult to argue back against, except to say, look, if there's a claim that democracy in the U.S. is being subverted in a big way, it's on the person making that claim that has to demonstrate it. And just this kind of scattershot, oh, there's 148 bills and they're going after us, no good. Now, the other example that they give here is Georgia, and we'll talk about the Georgia bill because the Georgia bill has been held up as an example of all kinds of bad things by the Democrats and unfairly held up as far as I'm able to ascertain. Not that the Georgia bill necessarily everything's great about it, but it's just not the outlier that people say. Let's see. Okay, and so they point to here that the Georgia law is such that the state election board can suspend a county board if it deems the board to be underperforming and replace it with a hand-picked administrator. The administrator, in turn, will have final say on disqualifying voters and declaring ballots null and void. Instead of, and now this is characterized as, instead of complaining about balls and strikes, Team Trump will now own the referee. I'll talk more about this Georgia law later, but essentially the standard for removing this person is actually very high, and it requires that gross negligence be demonstrated by this person over the course of 2 separate elections. And it is reasonable to have some standard for replacing the person. And in fact, the Democratic voter reform proposals state that election officials can be removed under almost exactly the same standard as in the Georgia law. So the Georgia law, so this is not as purported that the Republicans will just be able to willy-nilly replace the election official. Let's see, what else do I have on?
Or Dems, for that matter.
Right, or Dems. Now, again, this is a point that is reasonable, that I think is in line with my concerns, that in at least 7 states, big lie Republicans have been vying for Trump's endorsement for Secretary of State, the office that will oversee the 2024 election. And Trump has endorsed 3 of them in Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan. I do not want to see people, stop the steal people getting in office as Secretary of State. I think that would be a really bad development. And it finishes off by basically reiterating some of Biden's the sky is falling assertions about the state of elections and what the Republicans are trying to do. And I'll just read the last bit. Biden saying, "We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War." That's not hyperbole, Biden said. "I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying this because you should be alarmed." Okay, so this is more of the just blanket assertion that what the Republicans are trying to do here is to just nullify democracy and steal the vote. And again, like I've gone through, there's a lot of sizzle, but not a lot of steak. I want to see the evidence. Now, on this, further to this topic of, are Republican legislatures changing the law so that they can just put in their own slate of electors and disregard the vote? So here's an analysis of this from a couple days ago, January 18th, from the Wall Street Journal. Okay, the election subversion hunt. Is it really true that GOP legislatures are trying to overrule their state's popular vote? They write, "The assertion that GOP legislatures are preparing to overturn a future presidential vote in their state is a major justification for the push for the Voting Reform Act, and let's examine to see if the claim is true," they write. And now they get to the specifics of the few examples, and actually give a few more examples. They get to the specifics that cover what Barton Gellman had done in his Atlantic article and a few others. They write, "Liberal legal and political groups are combing through state legislative dockets for evidence of GOP plans for election subversion. Barack Obama linked one such roundup in his op-ed last week, backing Biden's speech. It was titled, 'A Democracy Crisis in the Making,' and it lists proposed laws in 3 states that represent supposed seizures of control over election results by state legislatures. So the first state is Arizona, where such efforts are most significant, but still never passed a committee in either legislative chamber. A February 2021 bill backed by 7 Republicans in the state's House of Representatives would allow the legislature to reject or confirm the preliminary result of the state's election in a special session. According to Legiscan Tracker, it died in committee. Another bill with similar effect and a single sponsor also died in committee. A bill proposed in May 2021, also sponsored by a lone Arizona representative, would allow the legislature to revoke a candidate's certification of election by a majority vote at any time before the presidential inauguration. It died in committee. So yep, there were a few bills proposed. Shame on the Republicans that proposed them. I am against that. I think these were inappropriate bills. They went nowhere. They died very early in the legislative process. A February bill in Missouri, sponsored by a single GOP representative in the state's lower chamber, would also give the legislature leeway to overturn the state's popular vote. Quote, "The General Assembly shall retain its authority to name presidential electors in cases of fraud," end quote. It says without elaboration. Guess the result? It died in committee. Okay, so again, and this was only backed by a single
GOP
representative in the lower house, okay? And it got nowhere. It was dead on arrival. Finally, there's Nevada. Sponsored by 5 Republicans in March, legislation there called for a statewide referendum to implement something like the first Arizona proposal described above. That is, to make the state legislature the body that certifies election outcomes. The proposal, which died in April, would never have passed the state's Democratic-controlled assembly, and even if it did, it's hard to imagine voters handing such power to the legislature and possibly negating their own presidential choice. And then they write, we cannot find any other proposed state legislation that would do this. And for all of the sky is falling and scaremongering attempts and pages written that I've gone through to try and find, well, where is all this bad election subversion stuff happening? I just cannot find specifics from the left, and it looks to me like this is not happening. Like there's a few proposals that died, and that's what they're hanging this whole thing on. Narrower administrative changes. Now this gets back to the Georgia law, which this one is a law, the others are bills. Narrower administrative changes, like a provision in the Georgia law Mr. Biden cited that allows the firing of local officials for malfeasance in 2 elections in 2 years, don't count. As the Wall Street Journal had written last week, the federal election legislation Democrats want to pass allows the firing of local officials for similar conduct. Okay, and now I will just take that in a little bit more detail. And so what it says is that, and this is from the other Wall Street Journal article that had been previously referenced. If you read the Senate bill, the federal Senate bill that Biden supports, okay, it has a provision that states could not suspend local election officials except for, quote, gross negligence, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. The Georgia law that Mr. Biden is attacking features an almost identical standard. Before the state can oust a local election official, it must show by clear and convincing evidence, quote, nonfeasance, malfeasance, or gross negligence over a period of at least 2 elections. So the Georgia law, again, that's Barton Gellman's other example. It's not what he's making it out.
So it sounds like they're very similar, except that one only applies to Georgia and this one is a federal.
It was in the federal proposal that has now failed, and that Biden is now telling us that its failure means that the 2022 election is likely to not be legitimate. Okay, so we've got 2 tracks here. Let's articulate this. We've got 2 tracks. We've got the election subversion track, which is the claim that is a claim sort of on 2 fronts. One, that the Republican legislatures are putting in place laws that are going to allow them to throw out the vote and send their own electors.
Right.
Okay, that's one. And the other piece of the subversion track is the Congressional Count Act being unclear about what the vice president's powers are, and that there is wide agreement even from Republicans that it needs correction to limit and make clear that no, the vice president can't just reject electors. That, again, as we talked about before, the Democrats are not on board with changing that. Okay, I think clearly the Count Act should be changed. Okay, and the only reason Democrats are not doing that is to fearmonger in order to push for their other priorities, which, ironically, as I said before, I'm not really against. Okay, so those are the 2 tracks. That's the subversion track. And then there's the administration track. Okay, the administration track, and by administration, I mean procedure. And this gets to the kinds of things that that were really in the Democrat proposal. Like, okay, what does it take to be an absentee? How late are things open? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And the claim is that the Republican states are passing administrative provisions in order to make it difficult for minorities to vote, is basically the claim. And that these provisions are just overly restrictive, and shame on the Republicans for that. And does that hold up? Now, again, this is one of those situations where there's 140 bills and it's all Every one of them is just nasty and horrible, but we're not going to give you an example. We have to zero in on an example, and the Georgia law is sort of the one that the Democrats have decided to hammer the most on. And so we have to ask, is the Georgia law actually bad like the Democrats make it out to be? And so here we have an article contrasting the Georgia law to New York law. Because New York's a Democrat, it's in the Northeast. The Democrats, of course, are going to be like, yeah, no, New York law has got to be good. We're not in the ignorant South. Right. So this is talking about Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader. So no slouch, one of the top officials in our government. Not a nobody. Senate Majority Leader, Senator from New York. Chuck Schumer is the latest politician to cite Georgia's election law as a tool of voter suppression. Changes to voting rules, Mr. Schumer claimed, are, quote, aimed at Democratic constituencies, including people of color, young people, and urban people, end quote. I'm messing up the quotes. I'm not going to.
Don't. Yeah, it's okay.
He specifically cited, I can't be like,
unquote,
quote,
yeah,
unquote,
I know. And sometimes
quote,
it's
unquote.
not worded
yeah.
in a way that makes sense, and it just takes forever. I get it. So
anyway, it's on the screen.
Yeah.
People can read it where I'm messing it up. He specifically cited only one early voting place in an entire county that you have to travel 23 miles. Okay, so he's saying, look, here's an example of how the Republicans are trying to keep minorities from voting. In this county, they're only doing one voting place. And the county, the farthest from that in the county is 23 miles. Isn't that too far? This is an apparent reference to Lincoln County, Georgia, which is considering a plan to consolidate 7 polling sites into a central hub. Lincoln County is a rural area where President Trump won 68% of the about 4,600 votes. Isn't that interesting that the Republicans, that Schumer is concerned about the Republicans' dastardly plan to harm minorities by lowering by making it more difficult to vote in this absolutely Trump and Republican dominated county.
I thought it was funny when you said, when he said that, there's only one voting place in an entire county that you have to travel 23 miles. And I knew he was talking about Georgia. My mind went right to, that sounds like a rural area with maybe like small towns or even people living on large, farms or something. And they're probably mostly on the right. And they're probably mostly white. Not that that would matter because your skin color doesn't determine your politics. But that's where my head went right away. So I'm not really surprised at all that it was a rural area dominated by populist, I guess, voters.
I mean, if the suggestion of if the suggestion was right, that what's motivating decisions here was trying to suppress Democrat votes and enable Republican votes, then they would be doing then Georgia would be doing everything they could to make it easy to vote in this highly Republican county. Run up the score in the Republican county.
Or maybe they would try to make it harder to vote in, say, Atlanta or like large cities,
Right. So the county's elections director, Lil Vendor Bolton, is unlikely to be conspiring to disenfranchise minorities. For one thing, she happens to be black. Then quoting her, "The amazing thing about this is that the story is that I'm just after black people and I'm not going to let them vote," Miss Bolton says. That's what they're actually going out telling people, and that's crazy. And she talks about the reason for the administrative decision to consolidate the polling, and its cost, of course, and it's the presence of alternative ways of voting by absentee, by the mail. In Georgia, anyone can get a mail ballot, no questions asked. In Mr. Schumer's New York, by contrast, the first section of the state absentee application is an attestation that the voter is out of town, ill, caring for someone who's ill, in a veterans facility, or in jail. It is a felony to make a false statement in an application for an absentee ballot, the instructions warn. So in his own state, in New York, and I know this is true, I don't have the details, but similarly in Delaware, Biden's home state, the rules for being able to vote absentee and rules in many ways are more onerous than what's present in the Georgia statute. However, they're not looking for bad guys in New York. They're just trying to paint the Republicans in Georgia as evil. And so they are completely misrepresenting or presenting the obstacles present in Georgia out of proportion. Mr. Schumer wants to impose no excuse absentee ballot voting on the whole country under the bills that we talked about at the beginning, but he can't even convince his own constituents in blue New York. Last year's ballot included a measure to loosen the state constitution's absentee requirement. Not only did it fail, but it wasn't even close. 55 to 45. Another measure that would have allowed same-day voter registration also failed, 56 to 44. So it's not like this has not been considered in New York. New York voters are not on board with election policies as liberal and as accommodating as what's going on in Georgia that has been vilified. How about early voting? For the most recent election in 2021, Georgia's early voting period began October 12th, including 2 mandatory Saturdays and 2 optional Sundays, per a calendar at the Secretary of State's office. In New York, early voting period is October 23rd through 31st, the state elections board's advised.
Like a whole week.
Georgia opens their early voting on the 12th. New York doesn't open it until the 23rd. Yeah. And yet it gets presented as though Georgia is some backward place that's trying to prevent people from voting.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I am almost through this. We're reaching the end here, finally.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
Okay. Okay, and now this is from the New York Times about, these voting bills are not going to pass, and so party officials now say they are resigned to spending and organizing their way around the new voting restrictions passed in Republican-controlled states. Okay, here we go. There's going to be more real specifics, examples of these terrible restrictions, right? What do we have on offer here? Well, so they need to frame the threat first, as they always do. Democrats rode record turnout to win the presidency and control the Senate in 2020 after embracing policies that made it easier to vote with absentee ballots during the pandemic. But Republican-controlled state legislatures have since enacted a range of measures to undo those policies, erecting new barriers to voting, and remove some of the guardrails that halted former President Donald J. Trump's drive to overturn the election. Aha, okay. So we have a link here. They say, but Republican-controlled state legislators have enacted a range of measures to undo these policies, erecting new barriers to voting.
Yep.
Okay. So surely when we go to this link, it's going to provide evidence and details of these new barriers to voting and these new measures that they have put in place. Okay, where does it go? No, it doesn't.
Be a link that just gives the New York Times another click, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So where does it go? It goes back to the subversion. Okay, remember there's 2 tracks. Now we're talking about the administration track. This link suggested that we were talking about the administration track, right? Measures to erect new barriers to voting. Okay, not about that the state legislature is going to throw out the vote, but there's going to be actually barriers to voting. But that's not what the link goes to. The link goes to something about the state legislatures throwing it out. And this is just the header of this article linked to. In the turbulent aftermath of the 2020 presidential contest, election officials in Georgia, from the Secretary of State's office down to county boards, found themselves in a wholly unexpected position. They had to act as one of the last lines of defense against an onslaught of efforts by a sitting president and his influential allies to overturn the will of the voters. Now, state Republicans are trying to strip these officials of their power. Okay, it's all about that scaremongering, the idea that the state legislatures are going to be able to are now acting to be able to throw out votes. Okay, but here they are going to give us an example. Okay. the articles framed it as, well, the Republicans have put in place all these terrible measures, and now it writes, the Democrats say it will require them to compensate by spending tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars more on voter registration and turnout programs, funds that might otherwise have gone to promoting Democratic candidates. All these voter protection measures are not cheap, said Raymond Paultier, executive director of Florida Alliance, a statewide network of progressive donors. This is going to draw a lot of resources away from candidates, campaigns, and organizations. All this stuff we're going to have to do to deal with these new administrative hurdles that have been put in place. Republicans, whose decades-long push to curtail voting access was put into overdrive by Mr. Trump's false claims of election fraud after his defeat, are planning a renewed push to enact new restrictions during this year's state legislative sessions. Okay, but what is an example? Do we have an example? We do have one example in this article. In Wisconsin, a couple weeks ago, a judge in Waukesha County, the largest county in the state among those run by Republicans, ruled that drop boxes for absentee ballots are illegal statewide. Okay, so absentee ballots, much has been made of this idea that are there enough drop boxes? This has been an issue in criticism of Georgia. But here it's in Wisconsin. The judge is saying, no, we're not going to be doing drop boxes. Well, what does the judge say? Why did the judge do such a thing? Okay. After hearing 3 hours of arguments, Waukesha County Circuit Judge Michael Boren determined state law allows absentee ballots to be returned in person or by the mail, but not in a ballot drop box. The judge says, it's all good and nice, but there's no authority to do it. Boren said of the use of drop boxes. So the judge looks at the election statute, says that there's nothing in the statute to say there's going to be drop boxes, and so therefore there isn't authority for the state to do it. The statute's got to mean something, and so the judge says you're not allowed to have the drop boxes. Now, my computer's frozen for a sec. Hang on. Come on, don't do it to me. Oh no, what did I just lose? Well, I didn't. I know what I lost. Then I'll just say it in a sec. Okay. Now here's the thing with why the drop boxes are not relevant. You can just put them in any mailbox. Okay? Why do we need drop boxes? Everyone knows where mailboxes are. The link that I just closed accidentally was that the United States Postal Service has a policy that they will deliver ballots even if they don't have postage. In 17 states, including Florida, you don't have to put postage on absentee ballots, but apparently that's not the case in all states. So the post office developed a policy that they would deliver them without postage. Something that is not included in the Democrats' proposals as far as the 538 summary that I think should be done is to take that post office policy and make it the law that you don't need postage to return absentee ballots. Democrats ought to do that. Everyone should support that, but that wasn't part of the proposal. But the idea that the drop boxes are essential and that not having enough drop boxes, I don't see why we would need to have this parallel set of infrastructure. Everyone knows where mailboxes are. It's very well maintained infrastructure. And the absence of a separate set of drop boxes is hardly a major election concern. Now, the New York Times goes on. Another part of the judge's decision would also forbid Wisconsinites to turn in ballots other than their own and jeopardize city-sponsored ballot collection events like Democracy in the Park in Madison, in which city workers gathered 17,000 early votes in public parks in the weeks before the 2020 election. Okay, now this is one where Republicans present as a bugaboo the idea that Democrat voter initiatives will involve volunteers or people who are paid, probably people who are paid, but certainly activists, because the only people doing this would be activists, to go around and collect a whole bunch of ballots and then turn them in themselves. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that the ballot should be a personal thing. I think that it should not be legal to have, organized people showing up in communities, going door to door, going, oh, what's going on with your ballot? Have you done your ballot? And of course, these are all impassioned activists who are doing it. I think that there could be some kind of special arrangement made for those that are in a position where they represent that they can't practically make it to a mailbox. But I think that there is a very important interest in not having voters harassed with respect to their vote. And when you're dealing with absentee, that means you're not going to harass them in their home or in their community. Okay, so that was a deep dive. It brings me to the end of my sincere efforts to get to the bottom of, is the sky falling with this voting stuff? And I find myself just very frustrated with the Democrats in that it just feels like, let me guess, they're going to try to scare us. It feels like they do that issue after issue, and just coming up off the top of my head, climate change, COVID, election reform. And that's not to cast doubt into the severity of any of those issues, but it's just saying that it's not leadership to say that the sky is falling on everything. And it just sort of promotes fear. And having laid out sort of the framework for what's going on, as to how severe the voting situation is, let's get back to the fear. Let's get back to the fear and division. And I want to close this out with, so Biden gave on January 11th a speech in Georgia, where he laid out his statement of, well, how significant is this voting stuff? How much should you be worried? How intensely is the sky falling?
In our lives, in the lives of our nation, life of our nation, there are moments so stark that they divide all that came before and everything that followed. They stop time. They rip away the trivial from the essential. And they force us to confront hard truths about ourselves, about our institutions, and about our democracy. And the words of Scripture remind us to hate evil, love good, and establish justice in the gate. Last week, President Harris and I stood in the United States Capitol to observe one of those before and after moments in American history. January 6th insurrection on the citadel of our democracy. Today, we come to Atlanta, the cradle of civil rights, to make clear what must come after that dreadful day when a dagger was literally held at the throat of American democracy.
So the point is, he's here to talk about the necessity of passing their voting rights or their voting procedures proposal, I guess is a better way to say it. And this is the moment that divides all before from all after. This is the standing up against evil and for good. And he brings it home later in the speech as follows.
The question is, where will the institution of the United States Senate stand? Every senator, Democrat, Republican, and Independent, will have to declare where they stand, not just for the moment, but for the ages. Will you stand against voter suppression? Yes or no? That's the question they'll answer. Will you stand against election subversion? Yes or no? Will you stand for democracy? Yes or no? There's one thing every senator, every American should remember. History has never been kind to those who've sided with voter suppression over voters' rights. And it'll be even be less kind for those who side with election subversion. So I ask every elected official in America, how do you want to be remembered? At consequential moments in history, they present a choice. Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? This is the moment to decide, to defend our elections, to defend our democracy.
Man, that is some highfalutin rhetoric, man. I mean, so apparently those that oppose him are with Jefferson Davis, and this moment is that intense.
Well, that's how it's being sold, at least. Yeah, I mean, this is not shocking to me. I think that our political environment, and it has been this way for a long time, so I'm not saying this is a recent phenomenon, although I do think more normal people have become more politically interested in recent years than have been in a very long time. But I think that we need adults in the room, and they're not in politics. So, I mean, and I'm not even putting this on a particular party. I think that people vote based on their emotions and their interests and what they desire, like what their wants are. But the way in which they make those decisions depends on how the case for a specific candidate is made. And the problem is that what used to be something that we didn't have a tremendous amount of respect for, which is basically general mudslinging and ad hominems and calling people racist or sexist or homophobic or communist or whatever it is to get people to not vote for them. I think that that's beyond the lowest form of discussion. And unfortunately, we're not going to get an elevated, rational, good faith discussion from our representatives, because I think there's a war going on, a political, cultural war within our institutions that is basically gone from the back room of some club out into the street, and now we're looking at it. And I think it's one of the things that's making it so hard for most people to make rational decisions and have rational conversations with people across the aisle and even on their own side, because as we know, many of these political groups are themselves splintered, right? So it's not like the Democrats are one organism and the Republicans are one organism. There's populists and there's neocons and there's neoliberals and there are socialists and all kinds of progressives, all these other groups. And what we need is more good faith, rational discourse, and not all of this. It's fear mongering, really, but it's about emotional influence, I guess is the best way to put it, right? You can make people afraid, make them angry, make them feel like they're targets of the other side, of this enemy over here, right? Or which is much harder to do, would be to say, okay, well, we all want what's best for our country. Let's figure out where we are the same, and then after that, let's figure out where we differ, and then let's work together to find out what's, where the truth is at, because that's what we need. We need people to seek the truth, because you're not going to get it especially not from politicians, but you're also, we don't have a lot of faith in our journalists either, right? And they're the people that we typically rely on for this. So anyway, I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a side rant, but it was just something I was thinking about,
No, I think that is a really good way to end, sort of philosophically.
Yeah.
What's going on, right? Because the sides are fractured, right? on the Republican side right now, the biggest fracture is, are you a Trump loyalist or are you going some other way? And I have not been subtle about suggesting that people need to go another way. Okay, that's the Republican side. On the Democrat side, you've got basically the far progressives and the rest of the party's kind of scared of them being dragged along by them. And something similar had happened with the Republicans not that long ago with the Tea Party, just sort of the mirror image.
I think the Tea Party is, I think it's the evolution of what you say, like the America First, MAGA, whatever, populist crowd. And and on the left, there are, like I said, there's like the establishment. Both sides have their establishment, right? And people, and this is one of the things that I think is great about like me, going to talking to teachers and having small talk with them, or going to a dog park and running into people there and just chatting up about whatever's going on in the world, which all of it's been made political. So everybody's making politically oriented statements about it. And some of the things that I learned about this is that the establishment figures are disliked by almost everyone, even in their own party, right? So nobody likes Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or other what they call neoliberal war hawks, Hillary Clinton, etc. But on the Republican side, it's the same. There are people who don't like the rhinos. They don't like the Mitt Romneys. They don't like these corporatist, hacks. So obviously, and this is the thing that I think is kind of a silver lining for me, is that people generally have identified very similar problems and they're looking for a third option or another option, something else, someone who doesn't like more Tulsi Gabbards or I'm trying to think of someone on the Republican side that's similar. I'm sure there are. I don't really follow, the individual players. Oh.
I would go with Liz Cheney.
One. Yeah, right. It could be. But someone who's basically like, interested in what the American people want by and large, and they can compromise or negotiate. That's the thing about Tulsi that I really like about her. So, and I don't even really know what she believes. She could be, full-blown crazy feminist or something. But the truth is that when she speaks, or when she comes to the table, she isn't interested in mudslinging. Like, this is something that we used to, I think, have and I think justifiably so, disgusted reaction to. If someone came in and they were shouting and calling people names, and then they were using that as a platform to run on, I don't think that we would have thought of that as a good thing. And in many ways, it's become the norm. And I don't know if it's because we're all becoming dumber or what, but...
Well, I'm not a religious guy, but it is the kind of thing that makes me think about, okay, religious teaching. So it's so tempting what the media and politicians are feeding us now, which is, oh, do you want to know why life is so hard? The reason life is so hard is that there's these jerks over on the other side. And they're what's making everything difficult. And if it wasn't for them, then it would just be like utopia, right? And religion, I think, does a better job of saying, you know why life is so hard? Because that's the world and your reward is in heaven, and maxims like that weird maxim from the Bible that I'm probably going to mess up because I have found it. I've just found the phraseology strange, where it's something like, don't focus on the splinter in your neighbor's eye and ignore the plank in yours. Which
I know what you're talking about.
I know that. Wait, back when did they have if you have a plank in your eye, you need to get that looked at.
Otherwise, maybe you just have brain damage and you can't feel it, and that's why you don't notice it. So, but I do think, I think that what we need to do if we're going to try to heal these divisions is that I think that we do need to kind of boil it down to the most fundamental, the most human place that we can start from. It's like at the absolute base level, right? We need to be working on building community, be kinder to each other, be open to listening to each other. We can't, I think that and I think that the higher level discussions around how we solve the problems of our society through politics is like starting the story in the middle. I think that people do the best when they start at the base, and I'm not calling for a return to Christianity per se, because I'm also not a really religious person, although I was never an atheist. I always left that open, didn't really think too much about it. But I do think that we need something maybe akin to a return to virtues. They could be Aristotelian virtues. We could look at the, Philosopher Kings or whatever for that. But I do think that we need to rediscover it. And if that means that, we behave in a way that is in line with the ideals of Christianity, not that it matters to me either way, I do think that we will all potentially be better off for it anyway, whether it is religious or it's simply a philosophical choice that we're making. And I think that if we do that and that becomes our primary value, if we start to discuss virtue, especially the masculine virtues, which are really the virtues themselves, not that women don't have it, but I think that one of the reasons why it was formulated was because it was men asking, what is it to be a good man? And then there were other men that were trying to answer that question. And so I do think that that's what we're missing. We don't know what goodness is. We don't value seeking the truth anymore. We don't know what it means to have right reason and good judgment and honor and resilience and courage and things like this. I'm sorry, that was really off on left field, but I think for me, and I love talking about all of these, political things that are happening because I find them very interesting. But I think that the solution's got to come from the Shire, basically. If you know what I'm referencing, right? It's got to come from the Shire. It's got to come from the people that are performing small acts of kindness and love to their neighbor. And then it builds family, it builds community. And that from there, I think, is where you get the strongest leadership, the representatives of all of these virtues. So anyway.
Well, I think that it's easy to point to our leaders or the people in the media and say, look, they're just lying to us, they're feeding us all this stuff. They wouldn't be doing that if there wasn't a flaw in people that they were exploiting, right? And the internet is so new. The information, clearly this us versus them mentality has been accelerated in the era of the internet. And people haven't yet learned the habits of mind to make themselves not vulnerable to that. And there's a historical parallel to this that I think about sometimes. And the story is P.T. Barnum's American Museum. Okay, and let me digress into that for just a moment. So it's the turn of the 20th century-ish. Okay, so it's like year 1900 about. And New York City. What's going on is that for all history, people have lived in like these small tribes and then settlements and then villages, and families sort of stayed where they were at. Okay, they sort of worked the land, especially in the United States, because there was enough land. It divided among the children. Okay, but then around the turn of the 20th century, the land had kind of been used up, and There was industrialization, which made it more desirable to move to cities where there were good jobs and manufacturing and stuff like that. And so suddenly, the city started to grow quickly, and suddenly, like, people flooded into places like New York. And it was all these folks who were used to an environment where they knew everybody. And when you're in that situation, trust is really different, right? People are not going to really betray each other because they're not going to be like, well, I'm never going to see that jerk again. Doesn't matter what I do, right? But then they get to the city and it's different. Like, there's all these people that they're never going to see again. And there's all these opportunities to be overly trusting. And so P.T. Barnum makes the American Museum, which is like this prank museum, okay? And there you can go see a mermaid. And you have to figure out, okay, is this mermaid, what is it? Oh, it's a monkey sewed, top of a monkey sewed to the bottom of a salmon, right? And they figure out, okay, what's really going on here? One of the comical, exhibits that they had was where you could go see the egress, right? And you're like, dang, an egress, is that like a kind of bird? What is that? And you go through the egress. Egress is another word for exit, right? And so you go through the egress and now you're outside and you're like, dude, I need to pay to get back in, right? And so why was the American Museum successful? Because, as humans, we are these like information seeking machines. We're looking at our environment being like, what is the information I can get that will be most effective in figuring out how to move forward now? And all these people in New York, they're like, I don't know what to trust. I'm in this new unfamiliar environment. Okay, let me go to this museum that plays on maybe I'm too trusting. Okay, and sort of teaches me skepticism. Right? And so that's why that product worked at that place in that time. And I think we're now going through something sort of similar, where we have to figure out, well, what does it take to figure out who to trust in the internet age?
Yeah, that is one way to look at it. That's a good way to look at it. All
right. Well, we covered my big deep dive. Thank you for sitting through all of my in the weeds attempt to parse through this challenging topic. Okay, I guess we can stop recording. Thanks for watching. You can download the Roil app at your app store by searching for Roil Mobile or Roil Technology. Or you can sign up at roil.com. We'll see you there.